Ellen, for about 5 years now, the world has been grappling with an unprecedented economic crisis. From your vantage point as the global CEO of a $35 billion organization, how is 2013 looking and the next few years?
You know, you have to take it region by region because it's a different story depending on where you are in the world. You know, in the U.S. we've seen slow growth, but we've seen some growth. But coming into 2013, there's still uncertainty relative to the debt ceiling and the deficit issue in the United States that our government needs to deal with. And I think how they handle that will really determine what kind of year the U.S. has from an economic standpoint. You know, Europe, there is less pessimism in Europe today, but that doesn't translate to growth. I think people are expecting still about zero, maybe a little negative from that standpoint, but stability actually gives people hope in that it's creating maybe a new baseline from which to build from. But there's not much from an expectation standpoint on Europe. If you move to China, China was a bumpy road in 2012. You know, it seemed after the Chinese New Year, you know, every month was different. And then as they got into their transition of their government, you know, infrastructure spending, you know, hesitated. We're seeing some signs of life there in the fourth quarter. They talked about investing in photovoltaics, putting in 10 gigawatts of capacity in 2013, which will help from, you know, from that industry perspective. Now, as they come through Chinese New Year and the finish of their government transition, we think things will get back to a more normalized growth pattern in China. And here in India, there was some hesitation in 2012 with the rupee devaluation and, you know, some pullback on some infrastructure investment. But, you know, consumer demand is strong, and we see a lot of opportunity here. So I think growth will be higher in India in 2013 than it was in 2012. So, you know, all in all, an improving picture, but there's still uncertainty around how China will finish their government transition and how the U.S. will handle their deficit and debt ceiling.
So is that the consensus view coming from Davos, where you were there 2 days ago? So is that the general feeling among the corner room chieftains around the world?
Yeah, I think there was the alignment. It depends on what industries you're focused on, but I think there's alignment of an improving U.S. picture. You know, Europe is still low expectations and the like. But, you know, I think the discussion is still around the uncertainty, around what is exactly going to happen in the U.S., how will China complete that, and, you know, does Europe maintain that stability coming through? So it's something we all watch very carefully because you never know when another step will help or maybe hurt that situation.
Right. So talking of the U.S., it's obviously the biggest market in the world. And not just for you, but for many other companies. And if you look at the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling debate, there's some sort of a time which the U.S. government has bought on both these issues. But there's no doubt that the U.S. has to cut its spending. So when that happens, what do you think will happen? Will the world go through another recession?
Well, we're hoping that they can get it done. I think they understand the issue very well. Certainly, I have and many of my peers have spent time talking to our government about the need to get it done and the real need to create that certainty because economic growth will get stronger if they can create that certainty. So I think the opportunity is there for them to successfully complete it. Now, what successful means, I think, is going to we'll have to see how that plays out over the next few months. But I think it's an imperative.
But there are some signs of recovery, both in housing and even with the unemployment scenario. But how much more time before we see significant recovery in both these you know, areas?
I think that's the question. And so housing is improving. We'll see if it gets to 1 million housing starts this year. The projections are right around there. But I think a lot of it depends on how the consumers in America feel. You know, they basically every American got a tax increase in the beginning of the year with the increase back in the payroll taxes. So there's a hesitancy and a real concern about what's going to happen. And I think if our government comes through with what they need to do, then I think that will create a level of certainty and a level of maybe buoyancy that will help from a market standpoint.
So this is in contrast to what's happening in the U.S. Although it's one bloc, it's not quite one country. So do you expect it to be harder for Europe to come to some sort of a consensus on how to come out of this whole crisis? Do you expect prolonged pain and perhaps an inevitable breakup?
You know, in Davos, the discussion of breakup was higher last year than it is this year. I think there was a real concern about the euro and if someone would defect. You know, certainly you had the UK coming out and stating that they'd have a referendum in 3 to 4 years around their inclusion in the EU. But again, I think there is less pessimism. I think there is a realization that they have to figure it out, and it's not a short-term fix. They have to create long-term fixes, and I think it will take a while. I don't think it's anything that's going to turn quickly. I think these problems didn't arrive overnight, right? They've been building for years, and I think it's going to take that. Some people talk about a decade, and we're 3 to 4 years into it, if you listen to some of my peers in Europe. And so I think that there's a resignation that we need to be patient, but we need to be focused on making progress each and every year.
So when you look around, it's very clear that the world is growing at different speeds. So how is DuPont recalibrating its own growth strategies around the world?
You know, it's interesting because coming through the global financial crisis, so coming through '09, when we reorganized our company and simplified it and took out layers, one of the things we did was regionalize our businesses very strongly. So there is a regional leader reporting right to the president of the business on what the needs are in Asia, what the needs are in Latin America, and to really try to connect the differences, those differences in needs based on the differences in the economic climate directly into the resource allocation of the business. So where do we need to make investments for a business? Where does the research and development need to go and localize to create future growth? And I think that was a critical step in strengthening the needs of India or the needs of China or Brazil directly into the research and development that each of our businesses do to develop new products and offerings to really connect closer to the local customers.
Right. You know, a lot of analysts who cover DuPont would rather have you focus on agricultural science and maybe get out of some other businesses like performance chemicals, for example. Do you see that as a possibility where DuPont someday will just be a pure agricultural science, nutrition, and healthcare maybe, that kind of company with nothing to do in chemicals?
Well, I really see that we have the base of our company is science. That science leverages across multiple sectors. So if you think about that, we started in agriculture, in chemicals, in chemistry. We added biology, biotechnology, seeds, and really built out that franchise over the last decade. Nutrition and health, it was a small business before our acquisition of Danisco, and now we're a much larger entity in a multiple of sectors there in the food industry and building that out. If you think about the chemicals or materials area, where we're strong is in advanced materials. So if you think about Kevlar, Nomex, Tyvek, if you think about our advanced polymers and packaging materials, those are areas where science can really make a difference, whether it's in food safety or shelf life, or whether it's in lightweighting vehicles for higher fuel economy. And I think advanced materials is an area where both chemistry, biology, and material science will play, and that we have a right to win, to be very strong in that area. So when I think of the company, I think across that spectrum. And whether we're in a specific product line or not, we do a portfolio analysis. We understand our strength versus our competition. Some products come and go over the 210 years that we've been in business. But the science is really what is the strength of the company. And how do we apply that science locally to help our customers succeed? In the areas where we see real opportunity is in ag in nutrition and health and in advanced materials. We've been working in biotechnology for 15 to 20 years. Biotechnology traits have been around, have been planted very successfully in the world for the last 15 years. India wants to use to increase its food production. But I think the clarity is there that it does. And so the question is, how can we help provide that information in the appropriate way?